Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to explore the absolutely critical foundation of building systems and products that people, actually want to use. We're going way beyond just writing functional code or creating pretty interfaces. Today, we are looking at the actual science of user modeling. Because look, if you've ever poured your heart into a project only to find that your end users are confused, frustrated, or just totally indifferent, well, you are definitely not alone, and you are in the exact right place. We're going to completely reframe how you think about the people sitting on the other side of the screen.
Okay, let's dive into this. I really want you to ask yourself, who are you actually designing for? When you sit down to outline a brand new feature, do you have a highly specific person in mind? Or are you kind of just designing for this vague, hazy idea of everyone? Honestly, your answer to that dictates whether your product is going to be a massive success or a pretty frustrating failure. But before we get into the right way to model our users, we kind of have to talk about the wrong way.
Section 1. The Design Trap. Villains of User Experience.
So our first villain here is the elastic user. You know when a product team just casually throws around the generic term user? Well, that term becomes incredibly elastic. It bends and stretches to fit whatever is most convenient for the developer at that exact moment. For example, say a programmer really wants to build a complex nested file system. Suddenly, they define the user as this computer-literate power user. But then later, when they want to force the user through a super rigid step-by-step wizard, they magically stretch that definition and call them an unsophisticated first-time user. This elastic user basically gives developers a blank check to code however they please, pretending they're serving the user when they're really just serving themselves. Real users aren't elastic. They have very specific requirements.
And that brings us to our second villain, self-referential design. Be honest, have you ever built a feature just because you thought it was cool? Yeah, that's self-referential design right there. This happens when developers basically project their own skills and mental models right onto a product's design. And the problem is, your actual audience rarely extends beyond people who are exactly like you. Think about it. Programmers are totally comfortable with complex implementation models. They love a good command line interface, so they tend to build products that only other programmers can actually understand, and that completely alienates the non-technical audience.
Section 2. The Automotive Design Analogy. So how do we actually escape this elastic user and that self-referential trap? Well, to understand the solution, let's look at this. And this brilliantly illustrates the point from our source material. If you try to create a product that satisfies a massive, extremely broad audience, logic tells you to make it as broad in functionality as possible. It's like trying to combine a sports car, a minivan, and a pickup truck into one single machine. But when you arbitrarily extend functionality to include everyone, you heavily increase the cognitive load and the navigational overhead for all your users. You just end up with this clumsy, Frankenstein-like vehicle that honestly pleases nobody, which means incredibly low user satisfaction.
Now contrast that with this approach. Here, we're looking at highly specific individuals. Alessandro over here, he wants to go fast and have fun, right? So he needs a sports car. Marge wants to be safe and comfortable, so she needs a minivan. Dale needs to haul big loads and be reliable, so he gets a pickup truck. By designing different cars for different people with very specific goals, we create highly satisfying designs. And the exact same thing holds true for designing digital products and software.
Section 3. Defining the persona model.
And this right here brings us to the actual hero of our explainer, the persona. Let's demystify this jargon for a second. A persona is a precise, descriptive model of the user, what they wish to accomplish, and why. Now, personas are not real individual people, but they definitely aren't just made-up fictional characters either. They are composite archetypes based entirely on rigorous behavioral data gathered from actual users. We're talking real-world observation, actual interviews, field research. They take those observed patterns and formalize them into a tool we can actually use to build better stuff.
Section 4. Personas versus profiles.
Now, beginners often kind of confuse personas with other user models, so we really need to clear up these differences, because if you rely on the wrong model, it's going to steer your design entirely off course. First up, consider user roles. User roles attempt to isolate relationships and patterns of behavior, but they express them entirely in the abstract. They focus almost exclusively on tasks. Personas, on the other hand, express these relationships in terms of goals and narrative context. And why does this matter? Well, because it's incredibly difficult to apply genuine human empathy to an abstract class of people doing an abstract task. The narrative structure of a persona brings the human power of empathy right back into the design process where it belongs.
Next, we have user profiles. Look, a user profile is honestly often just a superficial biographical sketch. It's a generic name, a stock photo, and a completely fictional paragraph about what kind of car they drive or how many kids they have. It's usually just a demographic stereotype and is frankly completely useless as an actual design tool. True personas prioritize deep behavioral patterns and goals. Now sure, we might give a persona a name or a fictional detail, but those are just narrative tools. They're just there to make the real data come alive in the minds of the development team, not ends in themselves.
Section 5. Designing for user goals.
So if abstract tasks and basic demographics aren't the focus, what is? Well, the answer is goals. Goals are literally the engine that drives a persona. When you're synthesizing your research data, you have to recognize that human motivations range from highly pragmatic expectations all the way up to broad aspirations. User goals generally fall into 3 basic categories: life goals, experience goals, and end goals. Let's break these down real quick. First up, we have life goals. These are those broad, deeply personal aspirations that usually go way beyond the context of whatever software you're building. Examples include wanting to be the best at what I do or get that big promotion. Now, a life goal rarely dictates how you're going to design a specific interface button. However, if your product can somehow help a user inch closer to those big life goals, you won't just have a satisfied user, you're going to have a fanatically loyal one.
Next are experience goals. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that these goals are often entirely unconscious. This is all about how someone wants to feel while using your product. Think about it. People have a universal desire not to feel stupid, to not make mistakes, and to feel competent at what they're doing. Users rarely articulate these goals out loud, but if your software violates them, like if it makes a user feel dumb, their self-esteem drops, their effectiveness plummets, and they will absolutely resent and reject your system, no matter how many shiny features you packed into it. And finally, we have end goals. These represent the very tangible outcomes a user actually expects when they open your application. Stuff like finding a specific piece of information or finalizing a customer's order. End goals form the highly practical, fundamental basis for your design direction. But here is a serious word of warning. If you create software that only satisfies end goals while totally ignoring those experience goals we just talked about, you might get the work done, sure, but it won't be empowering and it definitely won't be pleasant to use.
So, the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote from the source material. The best way to successfully accommodate a variety of users is to design for specific types of individuals with specific needs. It's that simple. You don't build a car for everyone, you build a sports car for Alessandro. When you define specific personas based on real behavioral data and super clear goals, you finally stop stretching that elastic user and you stop designing just for yourself.
Wow, we have covered a lot of ground today, right? From the real dangers of self-referential design to the sheer power of goal-driven personas. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The very next time you sit down to architect a system, I want you to ask yourself, who is really sitting on the other side of that screen? Are you going to settle for a superficial profile, or will you actually take the time to truly map out their experience and their end goals? It is absolutely time to ditch the elastic user. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I challenge you to start applying goal-driven personas in your very next project.